Hi there, everyone. I want to say a few words about the interview with Sylvia Wynter that I had you read this week. It's a long one, and I'm sorry about that. I hope it was not too difficult. I mean, there are parts of it that are probably, a little harder to get through, but a lot of it is pretty narrative and pretty biographical for her, and so you get to get a sense of who she is as well. And I say is, I mean, this was done in 1999. I think, as far as I know, she's still alive, and she must be in her 90s by now or something like that. Sylvia Wynter is, well, as you could see from the piece, her background is in Jamaica. She spent time in London. She spent a lot of time in the U.S. as well, teaching. And she has a background in the arts. She was a dancer. She was a playwright. She did a lot of kind of artistic things alongside of the theory stuff that really came to take over her life as she got older. And so this is an interview which I guess the reason I wanted you to read it is in part because of who else we're reading this week. To try and rethink some of the things that come up with the other figures. Again, as I've said all along, my point is never to say, well, here's who's right about things and here's who's wrong about things, but rather to kind of broaden the kind of Western conversation about how epistemology, ethics, and social organization actually works, to kind of shine some lights on the spots that don't, historically at least, don't have a lot of light shone on them, and really to work up to reading Lorraine Code's book, because I think Code really kind of gives us a very rich sort of reading of the Western tradition, which inflects it with feminism and anti-colonial thought and environmentalism and a lot of other things. And so, the more background you can have to getting into Code stuff, by the time we get to her, the better off you'll be, I think. And I think, these all kind of accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish in this course, which is to really interrogate the question of ethics, not in its own terms, but as it intersects with questions of knowledge and questions of social organization or social institutions. And so, we can see that being built up through the Western figures, mostly dead white guys, as I've said before, but important. I mean, these are concepts that really inform a lot of the thinking that people have around what ethics should look like, how we know, what constitutes knowledge, and what a reliable and good social organization should look like. And so, someone like Wynter, I think, really kind of knows all of that. I mean, her reading is vast, as I hope you get that impression as you read through this. She reads not only in philosophy, not only in literature. She's reading in cognitive science. She's reading in history of evolution. She's reading, just everywhere, it seems. I mean, you really have to bring your A game to understand what Wynter is up to, which is one thing I really like about her. I mean, she is so well-informed, well-read, working with all sorts of different things that it makes her work very rich, I think. I also, and parenthetically, I guess, I also think that she is underappreciated, and part of the reason for that is that she can be a dense read, especially in her own work. I mean, the part of the reason I did not give you one of her own essays is that they're a lot harder than anything you see in this interview. I think the interviewer was actually really good at, asking the right question at the right time, giving her a turn of phrase that, she often would say, that's a good way to put that. And so I think there's in some ways more clarity about what she's up to in this interview than in some of her other work, which is not to say it's not important work, but if you've never encountered Sylvia Wynter before, she can be hard to deal with on first reading. So what is she doing? Well, interestingly, like we saw with Senghor last week, she is rethinking humanism. And that might be a bit of a surprise for people from the African tradition, the African diaspora. Humanism has not served Africans well They always end up at the bottom of the, humanist ladder. We see this most clearly in someone like Hegel. In his History of Philosophy, he right at the beginning, he makes very clear that there's a kind of hierarchy of cultures and peoples within history, and Africans don't even rank being on the kind of historical story that he wants to tell. They're like before the whole story starts, like they have no history as far as he's concerned. And so, that's a pretty common view, and we could find lots of other people who say stuff like that, about Africans especially. And so, there is this sense that, what humanism wrought from the Renaissance on was a kind of long justification for white supremacy or white centrality to the world project. And so, we saw with Senghor last week, and we see with Wynter this week, that they're going to push back against that, but they're not going to do so in a manner that simply throws it all over and says, everything that happened there is junk, forget all of that stuff, we're going to start as if we can start from scratch right now. Nobody thinks that. I mean, nobody who's really careful and reflective thinks that you can kind of imagine that history has gone away and just start anew from this moment forward. So if we can't do that, if one can't do that, what happens? Last week with Senghor, we saw it was negritude and intuitive reason. With Wynter, she doesn't take that route. She's not opposed, I think, to negritude. She doesn't talk much about it. She is really more trying to diagnose what went wrong with the humanist project out of the Renaissance, and to see the ways in which Black existence, both on the continent and in the diaspora, really are a kind of antidote, or a kind of, they still carry with them a kind of way of thinking about the world that is viable and it is really important, and that needs to, needs to come back into more focus. So I'm not going to talk my way through this whole thing. I want you to read it, but I want to just kind of point out a couple of things that I think are interesting on the way by. It's interesting to see how many times, she talks about herself, or she portrays herself as being on the edge of things, not really part of things. She talks about liminality a lot, and that slides into marginality. Okay, so being marginal is being on the outside of something, not really in the mainstream. Being liminal is a little bit different. It's a space of negotiation. It's a space between two things, between two identifiable things. The space where things change. Okay, it's like a membrane. It's like, if you want to use computer terms, it's like an interface, right? You think about those words, interface, right? Two faces, and so there's a kind of sense of identity about each of these things, but then there's a kind of negotiation. There's a back and forth between them. And that's where she places herself a lot. She places herself at a point of conversation, dialogue, exchange, however you want to put it. And she sees that as one of the kind of central problems with the Western project, which sees itself as a project, which sees itself as, we are marching forward. Here's what knowledge is. Here's what science is. We're in the mainstream of that, and the place to be is out at the front edge of it, right? Creating new things, discovering new things, refining things, whatever it is. That's where we are, and that makes for a very kind of focused sort of view, but it also means that you more and more distill, yourself down to a kind of more and more focused sort of logic. Now, here's what's interesting, and it doesn't really come out of this essay, it comes out elsewhere, but she sees that as a mode, what I would call a mode of production, but not a mode of creativity, okay? So the moment that everyone gets marginalized from that conversation about humanism, as soon as we get this story in which the exemplar of humanism is the white man, the white European man, and everyone else aspires to that, right? As soon as we start telling that story, we have lost the idea of creativity. Why? Because we've lost the diversity that comes with it. Right? Defining things in one sense, in one set of terms, means that we're not willing to draw on a wide range of things. And so, she's interested, she talks at various points about things like historical breaks and epistemic breaks. You see that in the French tradition of philosophy of science. Gaston Bachelard talks about that. And it's really clusters around the idea of re-asking questions, right? The questions we think are the right questions might not be the right questions. And so culturally, she's interested in what constitutes a better question than what we have been asking in the past. Again, that takes you out of that kind of focused, what's next, how do we develop, this logic one step further. It takes you out of that stream and somewhere else. So she is interested, as I've said, in the Renaissance and the humanism that comes out of that. Her idea, and you see this on page 179, both her interviewer and she says this, at the end of the blind alley that is Europe, there's Hitler, right? And so they talk, about genocide. They talk about the Holocaust. They talk about, the idea that the logical result of all of this is essentially white supremacy. Even if that is just of the sort that celebrates the accomplishments of the West and not the sort that, ends up in the oppression of everyone, it's still the oppression of everyone, right? I mean, the celebration of those accomplishments is still that logic of, going down this one stream and sacrificing, getting rid of everything else that distracts you from that. She also talks about that being the logic of secularization, by which she doesn't mean a literal abandonment of religion, but really the kind of attempt to reduce all life to calculable things. And so, like Senghor, she is trying to re-mythologize. She's trying to say there's something about the myths that we have, not that they're kind of archetypal in that kind of Jungian sense, where, like with Star Wars, we have the hero figure and the villain figure and the, all of these figures that are somehow represented. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about mythologizing. We're talking about the idea that meaning is born in some other way than simply a logical deduction from, where we've been in the past. It's born artistically. It's born musically. It's born, through dance. It's born through theater. It's born in ways that sometimes we feel before we know, right? Echoes of negritude there. Simply being on that kind of Renaissance humanist path, I think she's pretty clear that this is the nature and source of evil. It comes out of the lack of creativity. This version of humanism that we take for granted is not just bad for blacks and everyone else who's marginalized, it's bad for everyone, right? It makes us all worse. And so she positions feminism within all of this as well, not as a fundamental analytic of opposition, but one which is very useful in recognizing how humanism excludes women as well as excluding blacks and as well as excluding others. Doesn't mean that these things are reducible to each other as if it's, we can put them all in one basket. They're, very different in some ways, but there is that similarity of logic at that point at least. She talks about this notion of sociogeny, okay, on 186. Gets it from Fanon, and if you actually look at Frantz Fanon, he mentions it like once in this very kind of offhand manner. And so she makes quite a lot out of this. And so you need to think about this in connection with the other terms that she mentions there, phylogeny and ontogeny. So I don't know how many of you remember your kind of history of biology, but phylogeny is about the development of a species over time, and ontogeny is the development of an individual, usually in fetus or before birth. And so they used to have this phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what it means is that people used to believe that if you look at the development of a fetus, that tracks the path of the development of the species. Okay, so, or even not just the species, but across species. So a fetus starts out looking like a fish and then moves on to looking like something else, like a lizard or something like that, and eventually comes up to looking like a human being. This is a ridiculous theory, okay, just to say that's not how it works. But there is this interesting thing that she tries to work with, which is another layer of all of that, which she calls sociogeny following Fanon. And what she means by it is this idea that that society, that culture also is a kind of developmental sort of thing. And we need to take that cultural development into account, and that it reflects back on our very biological and physical development. In other words, these things are not separate things, right? We, blacks especially, develop in part because of the colonial strictures they've been under, and the experience of slavery, and the experience of apartheid, and the experience of all of these sorts of things. That's part of the culture over hundreds of years, and that has also affected the forms of development of people as individuals. We are only coming to realize the truth of this relatively recently. We're only coming to realize, for example, that historical racism, over generations has an effect on people's very biology, very development, and lifespan, and also all sorts of things like that. We can now start to get a glimmer. We're not very far into it, I think, yet, but we're starting to realize that there is a cultural and shared echo of those sorts of things down to how people live now. And so she is really trying to kind of, help us to see that sociogeny, understood that way, is a problematic thing, but it does not need to be understood that way. In other words, our sociogenic development could be a positive one, could be one in which there is a history of positive development. Renaissance humanism has made that difficult, not only for black people, not only for First Nations, Native American people, not only for Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, but also for white people. Right? It's stuck everyone within a particular kind of path, and so stopped development. So this is part of the way she's looking at all of this. So, as the title of this interview has it, The Re-Enchantment of Humanism, this is what she's after on page 190 and following. You would think that we would get rid of or give up on humanism at this point, but just like Senghor, she doesn't want to do that, right? She wants to, as she puts it, complete the incomplete victory of humanism. So she thinks that significant things were gained, but at a serious cost. And so what we need to do, in a certain sense, is figure out how we restart the engine of creation so that we are not simply, replicating the patterns of the past, replicating the systems of injustice of the past, but we can, at the same time, recognize what was gained in terms of understanding how we operate as individuals, understanding how systems operate, all of those sorts of things that come out of Renaissance thought, and recognize that someone other than black men are, someone other than white men are the repositories of that, right? It's not just that exemplar of Renaissance humanism that is operative anymore. And so, that's the quick version of Sylvia Wynter. There's obviously a ton more in this interview, and I hope I hope you're interested in it, because I think Wynter really, provides a good launching pad into what we're going to see with Lorraine Code starting with next week. So anyway, that is a bit on Sylvia Wynter, and looking forward to the discussion area. Thanks.